For most of recorded history across almost all cultures, humanity has organized itself hierarchically, with those wielding the most power and privilege at the top, and those with the least of these at the bottom. The specific tier that you occupy in the hierarchy is known as your caste or class. Until relatively recently, there was almost no practical way to change what class you belonged to. If you were born a peasant, you would die a peasant.
And only your fleas will mourn you.
In the Hindu caste system, which still exists in India today, it is believed that the caste you were born into is determined by your actions in your previous life, and by acting properly within your caste, you may be born into a different, higher one in your next life. Religious justifications are fairly common in class systems, such as with the concept of the divine right of kings in late medieval Europe, or the mandate of heaven in imperial China. China offers an example of a class system with built-in upward mobility, with an extensive system of examinations used to elevate skilled people in lower classes to jobs that put their skills to good use. Now, this meritocracy had its limits. Certainly there was no exam you could do well enough on to become emperor. Traditionally, the only ways to occupy the top of the social pyramid in any culture has been either to be a close relative of the previous ruler, or to take the position by force. Democracy, until recently, has been rather rare. With the revolutions of the late 1700s and early 1800s, many class systems were upended and replaced with the one we in the Western world are most familiar with: the lower or working class, the middle class, and the upper class. The working class makes just enough money to get by, if that, with little left over for luxuries. The middle class lives more comfortably and can usually afford to purchase their own home and take a vacation once or twice a year. The upper class does whatever the hell they want. Proponents of this system argue that it is meritocratic, with your position in the hierarchy determined by how much money you have, which of course under capitalism is purely a function of how useful you are, right? Hence, the more you do for society, ostensibly the more power you have in that society. However, political philosophers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels pointed out that wealth has a certain gravity of its own that has nothing to do with how much effort you actually put in. Author Terry Pratchett put it rather well through the lens of his surprisingly class-conscious cop, Samuel Vimes. The reason that the rich were so rich, Vimes reasoned, was because they managed to spend less money. Take boots, for example. A really good pair of leather boots cost $50, but an affordable pair of boots, which were sort of okay for a season or two and then leaked like hell when the cardboard gave out, cost about $10. But the thing was that good boots lasted for years and years. A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that'd still be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time, while a poor man who could only afford cheap boots would have spent $100 on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet. This principle expands easily to cover the idea of leasing an apartment versus owning a home. The home is the more expensive initial investment, but in the long run cheaper than paying for rent every month, even while you're still paying off your mortgage. And beyond the simple idea of personal wealth letting you buy quality products, thus saving you money in the long run, wealth also allows you to buy land and machines and vehicles. In other words, the means of production. Then, by simply owning these means that are required to create anything, you are able to charge others rent in order to use them. Or you pay workers a pittance to use them for you, then sell the products they make. Wealth makes more wealth, and the poor are kept poor. It is for this reason that Marx and Engels argued for political revolution to abolish ownership of the means of production. Because what does the owner add exactly? It's the workers that the owner pays a salary to that make all the products and perform all the maintenance. All the owner does is have their name on a piece of paper. All the work could be done without the owner, with any profits from the work done being more fairly distributed. But alas, almost every communist movement has either been repressed or subverted by authoritarians. So we still live in a class system with the wealthy at the top and the rest of us at the bottom. And those conservative thinkers who believe that capitalism truly is a meritocracy also still exist. And thanks to the idea of the Protestant work ethic, they have managed to propagate quite widely the idea that financial failure is a moral failing. Despite the Gospels literally having Jesus say that money is bad, you should give it away because the rich can't get ticket into heaven, the capitalist class system has intertwined itself quite inextricably with Christian morality. In the United Kingdom, the old class system of feudalism kind of never actually went away, with the country still having a monarch and a House of Parliament filled by aristocrats and religious figures. But now, instead of directly wielding authority, these former nobles now cling to the trappings of etiquette and protocol as a means of sneering down at those who don't know all the Byzantine rules of how to navigate an 11-course meal. At the end of the day, does it really matter whether you use a salad fork to eat your entree? Yet we have fops like William Hansen who managed to make a living by telling middle and lower class people how to fold their napkins or whether or not they're allowed to burp at the dinner table. It's all a facade, a performance.
See how I do it?
But this maze of manners functions as a shibboleth, a way for the wealthy to recognize each other and avoid the upstarts trying to infiltrate their ranks. And this is where the more modern definition of class arises. Someone who is tasteful and polite and well-dressed, who performs the facade as expected, is seen as classy, while someone who doesn't tuck in their shirt and slurps their soup and puts their elbows on the table is viewed as lacking class.
Ow!
Fun fact, the whole elbows on the table thing actually has a practical origin. In medieval Europe, the tables used for feasts were just planks of wood laid on top of sawhorses, and if you leaned on them wrong, the table would collapse. Nowadays, we have quite sturdy tables, so feel free to rest your elbows on them. It does not matter at all. Now, most people outside the upper crust recognize that manners are, for the most part, just a bunch of hot air, but there are more impactful versions of this same behavior. Business owners will typically only hire people who exhibit what they call professionalism, but really is just the same facade of class. They expect you to be well-groomed, in their opinion, with short cropped hair and a clean shave if you're a man, and a bun or ponytail if you're a woman. This is often harder for folks of African ethnicity to comply with, as shaving often causes black men to break out in pimples, and black women are often required to straighten their naturally curly hair. The clothing and level of hygiene required for what are typically called white-collar jobs is often very expensive for a poorer person to comply with, keeping them out of the kind of employment that would help them leave poverty. Companies will also buy cheap property in poor areas, renovate them, then market them to the wealthy. This encourages those of higher class to move in and invest in local businesses, but also drive up the cost of living, pricing out the poor residents who had been there the whole time. This phenomenon is known as gentrification. Perhaps the most extreme example of this sort of thing happened when the U.S. interstate system was first being built, when the new roads were planned deliberately to go through poor neighborhoods, often with high minority populations, forcing them out of their homes. Throughout all of this, there is unmistakably a racial component, particularly in former colonies of Europe, where wealth is concentrated in the hands of the descendants of white settlers, who wield their class power to keep indigenous peoples and the descendants of former slaves from sharing in their wealth. But diving into such race relations deserves a video unto itself, which I may get to eventually. The main takeaway I want to drive home here is that all class consciousness must be intersectional. It's not just poor versus rich. There are different experiences depending on your race, gender, religious background, and sexual orientation. And if we want to get anything done, we need to be able to acknowledge those differences and learn how to work together. One person who managed to climb the social ladder was Walt Disney. The name Disney actually comes from a noble Norman house, Disney, which has its own coat of arms, which you can see both in Fantasyland and in the newest version of the Disney Studio logo that appears at the start of their films. Walt actually ended up returning to France briefly during World War I, after fudging the date on his birth certificate to pretend to be old enough. But by the time he arrived, the war was basically over and he never saw any combat. Despite the noble pedigree, Walt's father Elias didn't have much more than the name to show for it, and the family moved around Middle America multiple times following a variety of work opportunities. Of most import to us today is the time Walt spent in Marceline, Missouri, upon which the setting of Lady and the Tramp is largely based. The film's suburbs and downtown are recreations of how Walt remembered the town he grew up in, and today you can visit the Walt Disney Hometown Museum, located in the town's old train station. In fact, Tramp's introductory scene takes place at an homage to the old Marceline rail yards, where the dog wakes up on the the literal wrong side of the tracks, subtle as a baseball bat, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Lady and the Tramp is the closest the canon has to an original story within Walt's lifetime. Dumbo was based on a book that never ended up getting published, and various segments of the package films could be considered original ideas, but none of them are full features. The idea for this film came from Joe Grant, a concept artist at the Disney studio, who drew up some sketches of his own dog, Lady. The premise was to tell a story from the dog's point of view and how she was pushed aside by the arrival of a baby. However, there wasn't really much actually happening in the story, and like so many other Disney films I've discussed, the film ended up languishing in development hell for a long time. Then in the mid-40s, Walt read a short story in Cosmopolitan magazine, yes, the same one he found Bongo in, called Happy Dan, the Cynical Dog. Honestly, short story is rather a stretch. It's less than 600 words and fits comfortably on a single page in Google Docs. It's more of a writing prompts Tumblr post than an actual narrative, and if I really wanted to waste 5 minutes, I could just read the whole thing to y'all right now. But I won't, because it's still under copyright. In short, well, shorter, Dan doesn't believe in being tied down to one family and eats and sleeps at a different house every day of the week, and none of his owners have cottoned on to that. He has no actual affection for humans, but pretends to because it gets him food. Walt read those 600 words and thought, now there's a likable protagonist, bought the rights to the story and told Joe to shove Happy Dan into his personal story about his own dog and baby daughter. It shouldn't come as a surprise that Grant left the studio in 1949, apparently disagreeing with the company branching out into live action and theme parks, but Walt seems to have made a habit of butting heads, and who knows what went down between them to cause Grant's departure. At any rate, Grant returned to the studio in the late 80s, after Walt's death, and had a role in shaping the Disney Renaissance, which we will discuss in due time. Despite the original writer of the story no longer working at the studio, production continued on Lady and the Tramp, and Ward Green, the guy who wrote the Cosmo Dog story, was commissioned to write a novelization of it a couple years prior to its release. It is that novel that the film's opening credits claim it is based on. Joe Grant is not mentioned in the credits at all, and this might be the tinfoil hat talking, but that sounds to me like some drama went down, and Walt let his pettiness take over. Walt later claimed that he once gave his wife a dog in a hat box as a Christmas present, but Disney's own official making-of documentary for the film disputes that.
I've heard this, and I know Joe goes,
Whether Walt gave Lily the puppy in the hat box or didn't give Lily the puppy in the hat box, he knew that the story was a good one.
Adding more fuel to my tinfoil drama fire. What cannot be disputed is that Lady and the Tramp was the first film in the canon and the first animated film period to be made in widescreen, using the brand new CinemaScope technology. But not every theater was capable of projecting in that newfangled widescreen fashion yet, so the Disney animators made two different versions of the film, one in CinemaScope and the other in standard full screen. Both versions have been released on home video, so I would double check and make sure you've got the widescreen. It is absolutely worth watching in that format. The animators make full use of the increased space, and there is some simply gorgeous cinematography throughout this film. Much like Bambi before it, Lady and the Tramp grounds itself in animal reality. The camera is kept low to reinforce that this film is from a dog's perspective, and the animation of the canines is so well done that you almost don't even notice it. These aren't cartoon rubber hose creatures like Pluto, they move like real dogs, and this was even more important to get right than Bambi, as while only folks who live in rather rural areas might be familiar with how deer move, we all know how dogs behave. We know how they stretch, how they snarl, how they bark, how they play. Frank Thomas, the lead animator for Lady, took home videos of his own dog to get a better idea of how to portray them naturalistically. The film even begins with a dedication to all dogs, but I'll save most of the dog discussion for my 101 Dalmatians video. Beyond the animal characters, this is perhaps the most mature and adult-oriented film that Walt Disney ever produced. This isn't a bombastic fairy tale with dashing heroes and mustache-twirling villains. It's subtle, muted, nuanced. There's a surprising amount of moral grayness as it showcases the lived experience of a broad spectrum of both human and dog society. And it also doesn't shy away from biological realities either, such as in laying down newspaper for the new puppy. Lady ain't reading any headlines, people. Now, it's never explicit.
Vagina is where the penis goes.
But it's as frank as it could possibly be in the 1950s in depicting pregnancy, including showing a breast pump apparatus and implying very heavily that Lady and the Tramp, well, fucked.
Well, as they put it, the birds and the bees.
Jock and Trusty offering to marry Lady after her evening with the Tramp definitely leans misogynistic in a modern lens, but it really feels like the filmmakers were trying to make this as clear as much as they possibly could without filling the screen with "The dogs had sex!" in big bold red letters. This film also drove home to me how secular Disney films really are, as the movie opens with an off-brand version of Silent Night with all the Jesus stuff snipped out.
All the world is calm and peaceful.
Jim Deere at one point groans,
Oh no! Can't you explain to Lady about Sundays?
and I don't know about y'all, but my raised Catholic ass was dragged to church for 9 a.m. Mass once a week, and I don't think Protestants differed much in scheduling. Now you might think, why didn't he say Saturday instead? That would have made the joke work without implying Jim Deere doesn't go to church. But Lady and the Tramp is set very specifically in the first decade of the 1900s, and the idea of having Saturdays off didn't become mainstream until the 1920s, partly so that Jews could also have their holy day of rest. In this film, the only time we see a church is from a distance, when we're viewing the whole town. Outside of Snow White praying before she sleeps or Robin Hood's Friar Tuck, Disney largely ignores religion as a concept, with churches simply being places you get married in. In Lady and the Tramp, there's even a bit where the dogs go to the zoo but can't talk to the apes because
Too closely related to humans.
which is an explicit reference to evolution. Sure, the Sultan from Aladdin says,
Praise Allah!
and there's the occasional depiction of a dead character having wings and a halo up in the clouds, but such heavens never portray God or Jesus. Even the Ave Maria segment from Fantasia is just a bunch of little guys with candles moseying down a road. It's really not until The Hunchback of Notre Dame that actual religious belief is depicted in any substantial way. But given how central religion is to that film, we will, as ever, wait for that video to discuss it. As previously mentioned, Lady and the Tramp's setting is largely a recreation of turn-of-the-century Marceline, Missouri, where a young Walt spent a significant chunk of his childhood. The same year the film released, Disneyland first opened, and Main Street, USA has a lot of similarities to the one depicted in the movie. Lady and the Tramp is drenched with nostalgia, allowing an older Walt to vicariously relive his younger years. The movie begins, and much of it takes place within the suburbs, which since their inception have been seen as the main bastion of the middle class in America. The urban poor historically have lived in fairly close quarters, whether in row houses or apartment buildings. The privilege of having not just a front lawn, but space between your home and your neighbors is something only a middle to upper class job can afford you. It is also something uniquely American. In Britain, even the suburbs have houses stacked right on top of each other. In Europe, a house standing alone is either a peasant's cottage or a palatial manor home. But in the United States, where there was a lot more space per person after forcing out all those pesky Native Americans, see my Melody Time video for more details on that, having a home with a fully surrounding lawn was affordable to those of middle income. Where in Europe, children of every class typically played in communal spaces such as village greens or parks, in the United States they could be confined to the greenery immediately next to their home, letting their parents keep a closer eye on them and shelter them from the poorer children who were forced to play in the street. Because the entire point of the American suburb is to isolate your family. It prevents the development of actual community because you spend all your free time with your immediate family. But still, the siren song of that open space you could call your own tempted many in the United States throughout the 20th century. This is literally the American dream, and that dream has been used to enforce both class and race segregation for almost 200 years. Now I realize I'm already being rather hypercritical, but this is not a critique of the film. I am using the film as a way to critique the class system we live in. There's a difference. For the movie, the suburbs are simply set dressing, but a very effective one at that. The contrast between the Victorian houses with their gorgeous green lawns and the dingy brown streets and dilapidated fences of downtown is very effective at showing how differently the communities residing in each place live. Where Tramp must exist in muddy alleyways 4 foraging for his dinner, Lady grows up in privilege and comfort, and their respective places of origin inform their characters more than any other factor. Even their names, Lady and Tramp, are class signifiers. This is not me reading too much into a children's movie. The film has deliberately chosen to tell a story about class differences. So let's explore what it has to say.
Shall we?
Lady is adopted as an adorable little puppy, and for her first night, Jim Deere, the male half of the couple who owns her, tries to put his foot down and set some ground rules, namely that dogs sleep in the kitchen. But Lady is literally a baby and does not want to sleep alone. And this is where we need to be careful about what characters in a film are saying and what the film itself is trying to say. Jim Deere natters on about,
Now, darling, if we're going to show her who's master, we must be firm from the very beginning.
As if Lady were a soldier at boot camp. But the film, told from Lady's perspective, makes it clear that this is neither right nor effective. Lady does not want to be left alone. She cries and fusses, and even with a chair placed in front of the door, manages to sneak upstairs and into their bed, where Jim Deere finally gives up and lets her stay. Whether it's a puppy or a human baby, you cannot get them to do what you want by yelling at them or ignoring them when they cry. Anyone who says they taught their child to be independent by ignoring them when they cried has raised a child with trauma and resentment. A baby, by definition, is dependent on its parent, and when a baby cries or a puppy whines, it's because it needs something. The best way to get them to stop crying is to fill that need, not ignore them. The early years are a time to bond with your child or pet by showing them affection, and that they can trust you to help them if they come to you crying. And the film agrees. Lady is not shown to be pampered or spoiled, but well-adjusted and happy. Meeting a child's needs is not the same thing as being a doormat for your child to walk all over, but setting down boundaries and ground rules should not be a priority for a literal infant. The only priority at that stage should be making sure their needs are met. And if you can't handle that, then maybe you shouldn't be a parent or pet owner. By giving Lady what she needs, Jim Deere and Darling, the female human, have raised a loyal and obedient dog. She comes when she's called.
Oh, it's Jim, dear. Please excuse me.
And she fetches Jim Deere slippers and newspaper, even if she has trouble getting the paper without ripping it.
Have you noticed, darling? Since we've had Lady, we see less and less of those disturbing headlines.
Side note, this is a surprisingly funny movie. There's a lot of great one-liners and visual gags. Lady is so loyal to Jim Deere and Darling because she has been well treated. Kindness begets fondness, and good treatment begets trust. However, I will point out that dogs should not be fed either coffee or donuts. Do not do that. The introduction of Lady also gives us her leitmotif. And let's talk about the music for this film. The score is done by Oliver Wallace, who collaborated with Frank Churchill on several of the Golden Age movies. It's fairly well done, but apart from Lady's theme, there's nothing in it particularly memorable. It does its job, and that's about it. For the songs, the melodies were composed by Sonny Burke, while the lyrics were written by Peggy Lee, a noted jazz singer. She also voices 4 characters in the film, including Darling, a dog at the pound, and the 2 cats, whom we will discuss in a bit. The songs are all great. He's a Tramp is a bop.
He's a tramp. He's a rover.
And Bella Notte is iconic.
Look at the skies, they have stars in their eyes.
What is a Baby is an interesting one, as the melody is simply a rising chromatic scale as Lady ascends the stairs.
Everybody's smiling in a kind and wistful way.
Broken neatly in the middle by Jim Deere whistling Lady's theme, which shows us, the audience, that even in Lady's confusion at their focus on the new child, they're still thinking about her and that she is a source of joy in their lives comparable to the new arrival. Both before and after the baby is delivered, Lady confides in the neighboring dogs, Jock and Trusty. Jock is aggressively Scottish,
with a bonny, bonny bone that I'll bury for me own in my bonny, bonny bank in the backyard.
while Trusty is a hunting dog.
He and his grandfather grandfather were tracking criminals through the swamps.
Pretty sure Trusty's grandpappy was a slave-catching dog, which is kinda yikes. Later we see an ad for an opera version of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which kind of feels like Hunch the musical, but whatevs.
Yes, blame all your cares and woes. I'm the one with scoliosis.
Anyway, Jock and Trusty congratulate Lady because...
You have a collar.
Mm-hmm. And a license.
Which, ignoring that collars are a symbol of servitude, for a dog signifies privilege.
The badge of faith and respectability.
Later, when Lady is put in the pound, it's the license that gets her out.
You're too nice a girl to be in this place.
Lady's collar denotes that she is of the upper class and deserves preferential treatment. There's also a recurring image in Lady seeing her own reflection, which is notable because dogs fail the mirror test. What's that? It's a scientific experiment where an animal is secretly marked somewhere obvious, usually their face, and then put in front of a mirror to see what they do. Some animals, like elephants, apes, and magpies, recognize that the reflection is themselves and will try to rub off the marking. But most animals either view the reflection as another possibly threatening animal or simply ignore it. Dogs fall into that latter category, though that's possibly because they rely more on smell than sight. Nevertheless, in contrast to real-world dogs, Lady's acknowledgement of her reflection communicates to the audience that she has depth and dimension, that she's thoughtful and, well, reflective. Much of the movie is about her coming to terms with new experiences, puzzling out what her place actually is in the world. But in some respects, the film is very literal. It's a story about a dog being overshadowed by a baby, and that's a common enough occurrence that it can encourage the audience to consider how well they treat their pets with respect to their own children. However, that doesn't mean we can't take a figurative reading of it. Older children often feel put aside when they get a new sibling, and they have similar questions about what is a baby. Toy Story, which has an almost identical plot line to Lady and the Tramp if you think about it, is not literally about toys. It's about how friends or loved ones can be pushed aside when children or adults find new interests or new friends, and the resentment that accompanies that. Another possible interpretation of the change in Lady's treatment could be how people get less involved when they want to start a family. They tend to lose interest in activism or socio-political causes. There's the idea that people get more conservative as they grow older, being more inclined to vote against tax increases when they start paying more taxes themselves. However you choose to interpret it, the message is clear.
A human heart has only so much room for love and affection.
Where the film is most clearly allegorical is in the character of Tramp, who is animated by Milt Kahl. I love how when you watch enough of these films, you start to recognize each animator's style, and Milt's characters always stand out to me. He's perhaps best known for his signature head swaggle, where a character will rapidly shake their head side to side while doing something else. A feat which is as difficult to animate as it is to anatomically perform. Go on, try it. Try shaking your head like that during the middle of a conversation. Tramp, of course, gets in a head swaggle of his own at one point. Like Happy Dan, Tramp does not tie himself to a single human family, preferring to come and go as he pleases, though of course he tends to go places where they're happy to see him. One person he tries to avoid is the dog catcher, who here represents the criminalization of homelessness and being poor. Sure, in a literal sense, it's for the best that we have some form of animal control, but again, this film is from a dog's point of view, and our closest human equivalent to dog catcher are the police that break up homeless encampments and arrest loiterers. Tramp helping the other dogs escape from the dog catcher's cart is framed as a good thing, a heroic act on our protagonist's part, and we're supposed to cheer him on as he evades the dog catcher's noose. Among humans, the upper class don't care what happens to the poor, as long as the poor don't inconvenience them or make their neighborhood feel less classy. It's all part and parcel with gentrification, getting rid of the undesirables so the rich can isolate themselves. They'd rather throw the unhoused in prison than offer them actual shelter. And when Tramp enters Lady's neighborhood, we see how differently they view the world. Where Lady associates her home with comfort and safety, Tramp sees nothing but snobbery and pretension.
And a fence around every tree.
This is referring to anti-homeless architecture, the act of putting spikes on flat surfaces or extra handles on benches to prevent vagrants from sleeping there. All the money spent on putting studs on curbs to keep kids from skateboarding on them could have been used to make a public park for those kids to play in. But again, the rich which don't care about the well-being of the poor, just that they're not visible.
We've no need for mongrels and radical ideas.
And here comes Jock saying the quiet part out loud. A mongrel is a dog with no pedigree, of mixed ancestry, and this purebred Scottish Terrier is snarling the word like a slur. If he were a human, his Republican ass would have been saying thug, while his brain would have been thinking a word starting with N that my white ass is not allowed to say.
The sheriff is on this! What did he say? The sheriff is near!
Now you could argue that Tramp does barge in uninvited, but he walks over just as Jock and Trusty do every day with no reprimand. It is purely his scruffiness and demeanor that prejudices the upper-class dogs against him. He refuses to perform the facade, and that makes Jock want nothing to do with him. But the way he talks about what the arrival of a baby means gets Lady thinking about her place and how it might change soon. And change it does, though not with the arrival of the baby. That goes off without a hitch, and Lady is welcomed by Jim Dear and Darling to see the little tyke. But soon the happy couple decide to go on a vacation without their dog, and they invite Aunt Sarah over as a babysitter, and Aunt Sarah does not like dogs.
Good gracious, what are you doing here? Go on now, shoot, scat, get out of here.
Side note, it amuses me so much that the voice actors for Lady and Aunt Sarah, Barbara Luddy and Verna Felton respectively, will later voice Merryweather and Flora respectively in Sleeping Beauty, where they have a different sort of antagonistic relationship. However, the worst part of Aunt Sarah's arrival is her cats. Hoo boy!
We are Siamese, if you please.
You could have just made them be cats. Just cats. Not Asian stereotype cats, just cats. And I know some of you are gonna try to defend this song and say, actually some Asian Americans find this song representative of them. And I'm sure you can find some who do, but anecdotes are not statistics. Let's compare Psy and Am to the other broad ethnic stereotypes in this film. We have Jock, who is aggressively Scottish and is drawn like a normal Scottish Terrier. We have Trusty, who speaks with a southern drawl and is drawn like a normal bloodhound. We have an Irish cop who has red hair, and a couple Italians who run a restaurant and have big mustaches. Then you have these cats, who sing in broken English and have buck teeth and slanted eyes. Why is it always buck teeth? I have never met in my life a person of Asian ethnicity with buck teeth. I have never seen a photograph of a person with Asian ethnicity with buck teeth, though I've seen plenty of white actors in yellow face with buck teeth. Apparently this can be traced to an old Japanese tradition of blackening your teeth, which was viewed as more attractive than white teeth. But then if anything, black teeth or gummy mouths should be the stereotype. For fuck's sake, this kind of racism is even more insulting because it's just wrong! And then there's the slanty eyes. This is supposed to be a reference to the epicanthic fold present in the eyes of East Asian people, but for the life of me, I don't understand how you get slanted out of that. Even Asians don't understand it. Have you ever watched an anime? All those anime girls with big massive eyes are supposed to be Asian. The closest thing to slanty eyes I can think of is Brock from Pokemon, and look, his eyebrows are slanted, but his shut eyes are horizontal. As for the song itself, it'd be one thing if it were an authentic piece of Asian music performed by Asian American actors, but it was written by two white people and performed by a white lady doing her best yellow face. These people did not do informed research into Thai culture. They just smacked around a marimba and made their voice nasally and sing-song. Here's some actual Thai music so you can tell the difference. This whole trope is infuriating and it needs to die. Where was I? Right, Aunt Sarah hates dogs. The racist caricatures she keeps as pets make a mess and Lady gets blamed for it, so Aunt Sarah takes her to be fitted for a muzzle. And this is what the upper class does when you actually stand up for yourself. It doesn't matter how well you play their game or how well you perform the facade. As soon as you start to complain or be defiant or show any kind of emotion, the mask comes off and Karen calls the police. You can stand up and Congress and very politely say that queer kids should be shipped off to conversion camps, or that oil pipelines should be laid through indigenous lands, or that gay men who died of AIDS had it coming. But if you dare shout, or speak out of turn, or wear a t-shirt factually stating that Israel is committing genocide, then you are censured or thrown out. Because for the upper class, decorum is more important than content. If you, a middle or working class person, are inconvenienced by the actions of the wealthy, like rising rent costs, or fuel prices, or a celebrity's arrival blocking traffic on Main Street, you need to just hold your nose and take it like the obedient serf that you are. But if the poor inconvenience the rich, well, bring on out the police with the fire hoses and the smoke bombs, because I'm due at the golf course in an hour and that ball is not going to tee itself. This is most notable in the myth of the model minority, where someone who isn't a cis straight white man is taken in by the upper class because they perform the facade and are basically treated like a pet. Even though it's demeaning, at least you're afforded some modicum of luxury and privilege. But as soon as you put a toe out of line, you'll be dropped and muzzled, just like Lady. Understandably terrified and confused at suddenly having this contraption stuck on her face, Lady sprints through the streets where she's found by Tramp, who, with all his street smarts, takes her over to the zoo. However, there they find a sign saying, "No dogs allowed," and that to me is just a perfectly prescient commentary on the removal of third places from society. For most people, you have a first place to exist, your home, and a second place, work. But any third place to hang out with friends or relax costs money, or closes when the sun goes down. Your options after 7 p.m. are a bar or wandering the streets. Cities are supposed to have libraries and community centers and parks, but there's not enough funding anymore to keep those open. Budget cuts, you know. Meanwhile, the rich get their country clubs and golf courses and yachts and all the rest. So Tramp does the only sensible thing and sneaks the two dogs into the zoo. Fuck the police! While there, they ask various zoo animals for assistance in removing Lady's muzzle and finally settle on the beaver, whose whistling whine absolutely deserves a Lorcana card.
I ain't deep, Shenny.
The rodent's massive incisors make short work of the muzzle, and with Lady free, Tramp is able to show her how the other half lives. In a scene directly based on the Ward Green short story, Tramp shows off the various houses he's the part-time pet of, rattling off the meals he gets from them on different days of the week. But for Lady, he decides to take her to Tony's.
I have my own private entrance.
And while you should probably not give dogs spaghetti either, this scene is understandably iconic.
And we call it Bella Notte.
This is one of the more believable love stories in the canon, with plenty of time given to build up the relationship between Lady and Tramp before they start getting goo-goo eyes for each other. However, Walt didn't think the spaghetti scene would work, so Frank Thomas spent his free time animating the entire goddamn thing, only showing it to Walt when it was finished. After seeing it how Frank had imagined it, Walt finally agreed to keep it in the film. Thankfully. And how about these two? Are these Italian stereotypes racist?
Tony, dogs don't talk.
He's a talking to me.
Okay, he's a talking to you.
Mamma mia, mangerio che avere siti.
I don't think so. Unlike with the cats, these two goofballs have some basis in reality. We have all met Italian Americans like Tony. If you're looking for a hard line in the sand for when something becomes racist, for me it comes down to intent. Tony and Joe are clearly affectionate caricatures. Yes, part of the joke is that they're Italian, but that's supposed to make them likable. Whereas with the cats, their supposed Asianness is supposed to make them feel foreign and threatening. Definitely not affectionate. When you're making a cartoon, it's okay to have broad ethnic stereotypes as part of your character toolbox, as long as you're not using them to demean or dehumanize. If you want a heuristic, imagine your own ethnic group, whatever it may be, being portrayed the way the stereotype you're watching is portrayed. Would you want people to view you that way? If the answer is no, then don't do that! That's why
It's-a me, Mario! Woohoo!
Is okay and
If we sneak in up upon it carefully
is definitely not. After dinner, the two dogs spend a romantic evening together in the park with all the human couples, and after spending the night together, Tramp wants to show Lady what lies outside the suburbs.
Open up your eyes to what a dog's life can really be.
The middle class occupy a kind of odd equilibrium between the poor and the rich. They have some level of comfort and luxury, but not to the extremes of the uber wealthy. When the rich want to live a little, they drop a couple $1 million on champagne and caviar and a rented orchestra and throw a great Gatsby party in a mansion. But the middle class can't afford that, so Tramp wants Lady to see what life is like when you stop trying to uphold the facade.
With no fence around it.
Stop worrying about what others, or more specifically the rich, think about you and experience a world beyond neatly mown lawns and unnatural gardens. However, there are some risks to finding amusement this way.
But we shouldn't.
I know. That's what makes it fun.
And this is where Lady gets dragged off to the pound. This place is very easy to read as an overfull jail. We have a canine chorus howling "Home Sweet Home," a dachshund industriously digging an escape tunnel, and various mutts with Bambi eyes gently crying to tug at your heartstrings, which is very effective. I do wonder how many people in the 50s went out and adopted a dog after watching this film, especially when poor little Nutsy is led
through the one-way door, sister.
Again, the movie stops just short of flashing "They killed the dog!" in big red letters. The pound is also full of broad ethnic stereotypes. Let's compare two of them. First, we have the Russian-coded Bolshoi, who quotes classic literature and is presented as an academic. And then there's the Mexican-coded Chihuahua, who says Tramp slept with his sister,
Rosita Chiquita Juanita Chihuahua.
Which one do we think deserves the dopey ding? I wonder. It's the fucking Speedy Gonzales dog. Like, yes, people of Hispanic origin often have lots of names, but they don't usually use all of them. If the Chihuahua had just said Rosita and stopped there, it would have been fine. By listing out the whole thing in a sing-song rhyme, and you know those names were chosen specifically because they rhymed, it crosses the line to punching down. Fun fact, Speedy Gonzales debuted a couple months after this movie did, so maybe this Chihuahua is to blame for that. Who knows? As I mentioned earlier, it's Lady's collar and license that get her out of the pound. She has the right documentation, the correct papers. The only difference between her and the other dogs there is her social standing, her class. This is why it's easier for the rich to stay out of prison, while the poor wallow in a cell unable to pay bail. And as we've just discovered, the surest way to avoid prison is to be elected president. So next time you get charged with a crime, just run for office. Once she's out, Tramp comes to visit, apologetic that he let her get caught, but neither Lady nor her friends are having any of it.
Mongrel!
Can someone please put Grandpa to bed? He's shouting slurs again. But just as Tramp leaves, who sneaks in but a rat? Now, is this meant to be read as a criminal, a squatter, a child predator, maybe just a literal rat? Who the fuck cares? The fight scene is gorgeously animated. Tramp rushes in to save the day, but the one part that kills me, what keeps this from being one of the great Disney battles, is the noise the rat makes when Tramp catches him. I can't. Why does he sound like a squeaky toy? Why? With the rat defeated, Aunt Sarah comes storming in, but only sees two dogs and an upturned crib. She locks Tramp in a closet and Lady in the basement and calls the dog catcher. Aunt Sarah continues to be a Karen, believing only her prejudice, blaming the victim rather than the actual perpetrator. And what does she say when the dog catcher arrives?
And if you want my advice, you'll destroy that animal at once.
We've been after this one for months. We'll take care of him.
The wealthy and the police form a symbiont circle, scratching each other's backs. Which of course makes historical sense. Police forces in the United States grew out of slave-catching gangs in the South. Oh, did you not know that? Well, police haven't always existed. Sure, large cities had guards and rural areas had a sheriff with deputies, but cops as we know them are a recent invention. Most police departments in America were formalized in the early 1900s. In other words, the time period in which this film is set. And the main purpose of those new police departments was to enforce Jim Crow laws. God, it really is hard to talk about class without also talking about race. This is what I mean about it being intersectional. Regardless, when the poor are inconvenienced, they're expected to sort it out themselves. When the rich are inconvenienced, thankfully, just as Tramp is being led to the pound, Jim Deere and Darling arrive back home and quickly realize what actually happened. Jock, to his credit, realizes he fucked up.
I misjudged him. Badly.
and he and Trusty race to stop the carriage. This sequence is razor tense, particularly because poor little Nutsy established what fate awaits Tramp should the dog catcher make it back to the pound. They need to stop him, and fast. This is how you give stakes to an ending. Take notes, Peter Pan. They stop the carriage just in time, but only by Trusty physically blocking it with his body. Originally, Trusty was meant to die here, but Peggy Lee personally fought for him to live, and honestly, I agree. This happens way too close to the end, and Trusty dying would have marred the happy ending they were going for. The film ends with Tramp being adopted, and he, Lady, and all their new puppies sharing a Christmas together. This is a lovely film, marred by a singular sequence that is easily fast-forwarded through. If you're thinking of showing it to children, I give the same word of caution I gave about Peter Pan, explaining how this is a product of its time and not all of its choices were good ones. Because apart from those fucking cats, this is a very good film, sumptuously animated, maturely told, and perfectly paced. My one gripe is that despite showing clearly the social ills of the capitalist class system, the movie makes no argument for systemic change. Tramp singularly is adopted, taking him off the streets and into comfort. But what of the other dogs in the pound, all the other strays? It's one thing for an individual to give money or food to one beggar on the street, but if the city actually invests in providing housing and keeping open third spaces, then that person doesn't need to perform charity on an individual basis. But of course, that would require an upper class that actually cares about that, and in the United States and in many other countries, the rich have been accumulating more and more power. In the wake of the Citizens United ruling, the wealthy have been spending ever-increasing pots of gold on elections, to the point where Elon Musk paid for Trump to be president in 2024 and has threatened to fund primary challengers against any congressperson who votes against the bills he supports. Billionaires have bought our government. And how are they able to do this? By shrinking the middle class. Because Bernie Sanders was right. Through tax cuts and stagnant wages, the top 1% have been sucking up all the wealth for themselves, hoarding it like dragons. That's why rent and groceries and healthcare and education and everything else is so expensive now. While the wealthy grow ever wealthier, most people in the United States will realistically never be able to retire. And the worst part of it is that half this country thinks that by giving the dragons more money, the kingdom can be saved. At least the United Kingdom has no illusions that its class hierarchy hasn't persisted. In the United States, we like to imagine that all men are created equal, but in reality, some are more equal than others. The phrase, "pick yourself up by your bootstraps," is a common one, despite its physical impossibility, and if those boots are the $10 cardboard ones that Captain Vimes described, you will not be getting very far. In minimally regulated capitalism, it is very, very rare for a poor person to break into the upper class. But those vanishingly few examples are made to be paragons, shining role models for us all to aspire to. But the world needs a lot more baristas and gas station attendants and office minions than it does entrepreneurs and tech CEOs, so odds are you will not be the next Bill Gates. Sorry. The reality is that the main way to get rich in America is to inherit wealth from your parents. Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and yes, even Bill Gates all got help from their well-off parents. They didn't start from literal nothing. At the very least, however else I may bitch about him, Walt Disney earned his fortune. But Weiro, I hear you crying through your computer screens, university is the poor man's avenue for social mobility. Sure, if you want to sally yourself with tens of thousands of dollars in student loan debt that odds are you will die having never fully paid off. College used to be a means for gaining wealth and clout, but increasingly it has gotten more expensive, far outpacing the inflationary rate of literally everything else in the market, to the point where many poorer children are shut out from academia. Not to mention that the most prestigious universities largely give out legacy admissions, so unless you're related to a senator, you will not be getting into Yale. Sorry. But it doesn't have to be like this. The new mayor of Mexico City, Carla Brugada, spent her time as head of Iztapalapa, one of the historically most crime-ridden neighborhoods of Mexico's capital, building free third spaces. Called utopias, they include libraries, swimming pools, music halls, fitness centers, all of it for free. And it worked! Crime dropped! Residents can walk right into these places and receive haircuts, food, and medical care, all for free or at very low cost. But in order to accomplish this, it required public spending, funded by taxes, largely on the wealthy. When the wealthy are forced to give back to their community, everyone benefits. Because the crime that the middle and upper classes love to bitch about doesn't happen for no reason. As I said in the Ichabod and Mr. Toad video, criminals aren't some separate species of hominid, they're people like everyone else. While there will always be crimes of passion and the occasional cruel bastard who hurts for the fun of it, the vast majority of crime is done out of necessity.
부자인데 착해가 아니라 부자니까 착한 거지. 뭔 소리인지 알아?
It's wild how many people are quick to chastise thieves, but if you ask them to imagine themselves in a situation where they have no food themselves, most will admit they'd steal in order to survive. Just like with Lady at the very beginning of this movie, punishment doesn't work. Support does. The way Jim Dear and Darling got their dog to stop whining was to give her what she needed. When we house the homeless and feed the hungry and educate the ignorant and medicate the sick and give people the space and funds they need in order to survive, suddenly you have a society where there is no incentive for crime.
People improve when they get external love and support.
But when the rich are so intent on enforcing the class system that gives them power, that support doesn't exist and crime flourishes. And the poor will only tolerate such treatment for so long. History makes it very clear what happens to elites who ignore the complaints of the masses. On that subject, I am as ever grateful to my Patreon patrons, in particular Elijah Black, Gurgi85, Avery and their ADHDs, Jinx KB, Savannah Mighty Zebra, Tony Houst, and JC Alexandre. This content is supported by viewers like you. If you want to pitch in, it's only $5 a month, or 10 if you want me to say your name at the end here. Either way, please join me next time as we explore the final film of the Restoration's Sleeping Beauty.